Get those lights off. Off. Turn them off. They're too bright. Turn them off. Turn them off. Let's go. Ready? Turn off the lights. Turn off the lights. Turn off the lights. Turn them off. So much nicer.
Yes, welcome folks. Left Reckoning 62, where we are in complete control of the lighting. So much nicer.
In this country. No, Trump's outlining the GOP and now the Biden administration's policy towards the vast majority of us when it comes to electrical policy. Turn off the lights, baby.
Look, that's what I say. When somebody has an overhead light on, the ceiling lights, are you kidding me? Get a lamp on. So much nicer.
I didn't realize you were light sensitive, Matt. Makes sense.
I'm pretty light sensitive, yeah.
Well, we got a hell of a lot coming up for y'all today. We're going to be talking very soon, joined by return guest Kurt Hackbarth, who's a journalist out of Mexico, to talk about AMLO, his recent recall election, and even more materially, why the right wing is so obsessed with fighting his very common sense, in my opinion, public energy policies. A little bit later, too, we're going to be talking about the recent news from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and it is very not good.
Not good, folks, but vindicates a call that we made, and we'll treat it as if we made a preseason prediction that the Timberwolves were going to make the playoffs, and do a little bit of pat ourselves on the back. Yeah, because, not good supporting Chantal Brown. No, thank you.
And later in the evening, in the post game for our subscribers only, we're going to be taking a little bit of a dive into one of the most dystopian events I've seen in a while, which was Elon Musk's very, very strange and dystopian Giga Rodeo, to use the California version of saying that. He had a very strange event. We'll be breaking it down. Also, some stuff from Jen Psaki, and as always, your questions and voicemails.
What was your? I just want to say real quick, what was your exposure to rodeos growing up? Because there's a big. My hometown's got a. I don't know if it's the biggest rodeo in North Dakota, but I think it is. At least that's some little hometown pride in my hometown, Mandan. Where you can literally, when it's going on, you can hear the crowds just across the entire town. And there's giant fireworks, and often there's they also do some sort of what do they call it? Destruction derby racing there too. But
I mean, one of my earliest memories actually is there's this game where they put basically a bow on the back of a calf, and they let all the kids run around, and the one who gets it wins some kind of a prize. And I must have been really young, because I just remember sort of being in it and being really excited because I wanted to get it. But then seeing the absolute mayhem and kids getting knocked over and crying, and just being very, I don't know, just really shook me a little bit. But no, I mean, I'll tell you, I've been to way more rodeos than Elon Musk certainly has. So.
Rodeo clowns were a magical sort of archetype for a child growing up. I figured pretty cool, but yeah.
But we got something to get to first. A little bit of mayhem right here in the state of Texas. I don't know. Did you want to bring it up first, Matt?
Yeah. So I mean, by the looks of it, there's absolute pandemonium going on in your home state. Fox News is on the case. We got this here, and what's funny about this story to me is we all for as long as I've been professionally doing this, there've been these occasional stories about the caravans of migrants, and they've always been embellished, so we say, by the right. This time they're literally we'll just buy the bus ourselves. But anyway, here's Fox News covering this story.
Alert. Remember when Greg Abbott said in Texas that if the federal government is going to drop migrants off in Texas, we will provide them free bus rides to our nation's capital. That is a bus with 2 or 3 dozen migrants on board. We believe
it just rolled into Washington.
It just rolled into Washington. I think they initially wanted to drop off the migrants at the U.S. Capitol, but I think as close as they could get would be near Union Station.
They're being processed on the bus.
They're being processed. They're inside right now.
It kind of looks like a Columbus Circle right there. So that is what Jen Psaki referred to as, well, that's just a publicity stunt.
Nope, it's not.
That's not going to happen. Well, ladies, alert.
I mean, it still could be a publicity stunt.
Most definitely is one. I mean, the interesting question there is if, the Texas government is paying to traffic people across state lines, are they guilty of human trafficking in the United States? I mean, but this is a stunt through and through. And, Greg Abbott loves doing things like this. This is, his kind of bread and butter are these big kind of publicity stunts. I wanted to talk. I mean, unless you have it. I mean, obviously it's a joke.
I just got a couple things to say. Like one, the like laughter in her voice, like when she says like they're in there, is so gross to me. Like these are human beings, for Christ's sakes. And there's like follow-up interviews where someone's like, "Yeah, I'm from Venezuela. I knew like I'm being used as a like a prop basically by a governor of Texas." Texas leadership. And what I want to do is get to Miami. So thanks for it's easier to get there from DC.
Lift, yeah.
So thanks for the lift, guys.
Yeah. I mean, obviously like this is purely that kind of stuff is purely for Fox News people. I can't imagine that the actual, maybe we'll see, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I can't imagine the actual amount of people that they'll be bringing over will be anything significant. I mean, this is purely for, a large part of the country that likes to consume most of their news from Fox News.
Right. And also like, and then they're being processed on the bus. So we can there's a process we can put these people through. Like, fine. This seems like if they're going to get able to like go, like move on with their life at this point, that seems like fine to me. Actually, that's a good model of how this process should work. Bus them all over the place. Thanks, Texas, for all that bus budget.
Well, I mean, that's like clearly is a human catastrophe. But I want to talk a little bit before we bring Kurt on about another catastrophe, which has been a stunt that has gone hand in hand with this one that is getting a lot of attention from folks. Which has been Abbott's new push to have state troopers and the DPS double up customs inspections in Texas. So Abbott, and this fits in with a theme, by the way, of his government, where he's really leaning on his executive powers, which should constitutionally in Texas should be very, very weak. And he's really built a lot of that power out of whole cloth. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but he's gone through another big push here. Another stunt that he's doing has been to have the state troopers inspect all commercial vehicles that are coming into the state of Texas from Mexico. And boys and girls, this has been an absolute disaster. Just on the daily level, there's over $70 million worth of goods that enter into the state of Texas from Mexico. And these trucks have been stuck and delayed for days upon days. And a lot of the things that are being brought over the border are food, which means that trucks are sitting there on the highway in high heat, right? It's hot here right now. And food is rotting on these trucks. It has been a real embarrassment to Greg Abbott. And I just want to break this down because there's some funny stories here. And it also like really does reveal a lot of the ways that Abbott has been governing lately. So this is from Scott Braddock. Excuse me. Actually, let me bring that up in 1 second. The first person who really started publicizing this and alerting people in the state about this disaster that is likely going to start to hit us over the next week or so, as we see all of these major delays and things being brought into the state of Texas. One of the first people to push this is Sid Miller, who is the agriculture commissioner here in Texas. And he's a Republican. He by no means is any kind of lefty progressive, but he recognizes that what's been going on here is a complete disaster. And he got a lot of buzz as he was starting to make this point clear to people that Abbott's kind of stunt show here is having real material effects on the food that goes on to millions of Texans' plates. So Abbott today went down to Laredo, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But he came at Sid Miller, saying, this is from Scott Braddock, asked about GOP Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller's criticism of the border blockade. Governor Abbott says he had no clue what we were doing as far as trying to negotiate with Mexican governors. He was just completely uninformed, Abbott said of Miller. And there might be a reason for that, actually. If, Matt, you want to play that video here. Because here's Sid Miller talking in February about the state of the relationship that he has with the governor of Texas. And remember, I don't think I need to say this twice, but Texas is a major agricultural state. This is a very, very important part of our government. And just listen to the way that Greg Abbott is dealing with the actual business of running this state.
Mm-hmm. Do you and the governor speak often at this point?
It's odd you say that. I've tried numerous times to get a meeting with the governor. In the 7 years that we've both been in this office, our offices, never got a meeting with the governor. We've never got a phone call returned. Never got an email or letter returned.
Do you and the
Jesus?
I mean, that is
this guy's totally uninformed.
Well, because it shows what, I've been saying for a long time to folks, that Greg Abbott is much, much more interested in playing governor on TV and sort of, exciting his base than the actual business of running a state of 34 million people. And I think that those are places that you really need to be hitting him. So again, this has been a real disaster. And I think people, especially in Texas, have probably seen a lot on this so far because, there's been all of these videos and pictures of just, miles of trucks stuck on the border. And it's also worth noting, too, that Abbott is saying that he's doing this for public safety. And yet, despite all of this harassment, so basically every commercial truck that comes into the United States from Mexico is already inspected by customs. Right. So there already is a process to look for illicit goods and things of that nature. All this is done is just double up on that, using, state troopers who are not equipped or trained or used to doing that kind of work. And they're also doing these checks further. They're doing them across the state, which is creating just, logistical traffic jams all across the state of Texas. And as I've said earlier, it's been an absolute disaster, and it's going to mean higher prices for people. It's going to mean more inconvenience. But anyways, this is just one of those moments where, Abbott wanted to, stand really tall on something and almost immediately had to eat crow on this, because today, as everybody's been making a big deal about this, he went down to Laredo to negotiate with the governor of Nuevo Leon. So this is right here from Forrest Wilder. This is sort of, because this just happened a few hours ago. Abbott has now agreed to have DPS stand down on truck inspections in Nuevo Leon in exchange for some yet unspecified border security measures. Inspections will continue for trucks from all other Mexican states. Abbott, of course, tried to make a big show about this. And it just is like a very interesting political moment for Abbott, because he's not, him doing these kind of like stupid political stunts is not new, but this one just immediately backfired on such a material level. So he negotiated this deal with the governor of Nuevo Leon, and also, but also as of yet, as far as I know, has not come to an agreement with all of the other governors whose states border Texas. And I'm going to share this right now because people might not be familiar with the geography here. But let's just see the big win that Abbott got here for efficiency, see how much landmass he sort of covered up. So this red bit is Nuevo Leon, and this is the bit of the border, which will now be uninhibited. And it's pretty good. I don't want to completely dismiss it. Obviously, that is a very important, that border is very important. A lot of commerce does come through there, but you can see how the kind of symbolic victory that Abbott is trying to push right now is very, very far from any kind of solution to this problem. Again, completely manufactured. No need for this. No real need for this other than trying to seem tough to boys in Tennessee who watch Fox News to, who are going to, because Abbott is certainly going to try to run for the president of the United States in the near future. And this is exactly what he's trying to do. And he uses this state and the people here, and most certainly the human beings in Mexico, as a to try to beat his chest from time to time.
So I'm curious about this. So like that, and I buy your assessment of the motivations there. There's another one that sort of I just want to put out there, and I don't necessarily subscribe to, but there was a resistancy conspiracy theory about the convoy in Canada that was also meant to basically gum up the border crossing to keep the economy, basically keep Uncle Brandon and Justin Trudeau's economies from being good. And I wonder, like, if that, like, is that the only plausibility there is like they're gassed up by campaign people who are thinking that way and decide like, okay, let's go for this, and then rubber hits the road and it's like, okay, we need to like run this back a little bit. This is going to massively backfire.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, no doubt about this. And I think it's notable. We've made this point time and time again that in the kind of complete absence of like a real opposition, political movement in the state, the only direction that Abbott has to face is to his more far right people. Because, for example, one of the people who he ran against in the GOP primary said they would shut down completely all trade with Mexico, which again would be an absolute disaster, not just for Texas, but for the United States and certainly for Mexico. And almost every person with sense made that point that this was a completely ridiculous argument. But you see now that Abbott is basically saying, when he's been interviewed on this, that, well, I know that people want to have trade, but I also know a lot of people are very happy to have us, make a strong presence on our border. Again, this is not really appealing to the vast majority of people. It's appealing to a bunch of completely loony tuned folks, and not to get too geographical with folks, but in East Texas, as far away from the border as you're really going to get here. But I do just want to, remind people of what, the opposition is doing here and make two quick points, because this is all about Title 42. And Greg Abbott is trying to attack Biden over Title 42. And if people remember, we've criticized Title 42 on this show. It is, it's basically using the COVID pandemic to try to shut down, immigration or migration. It has extremely racist implications and a history here. And it's notable, one, because of that history, which is really nasty, but two, this is something that I'll be writing about more. There's going to be a lot more stuff coming from me on Greg Abbott, the way that he's been governing and what his legacy really is going to be for the way the system runs in the state of Texas. But it's a really notable thing that Abbott, first this sending people to DC, and this order here to have the state troopers inspect commercial vehicles, is all coming from him overextending his executive power, right? He is using executive power in ways that have never been done in the history of the state of Texas. And that's something that has, short-term immediate consequences and long-term consequences. I also wanted to note too, that when he's talking about Title 42, there's an irony. For a governor who has made it very, very clear that he doesn't really consider COVID to be a threat and hasn't considered to be a threat in a very long time, he continues to declare a state of emergency so that he can use those emergency powers that are given to him by the state constitution to deal with, a kind of health pandemic like this, so that he can do things like, do these insane border stunts, so that he can do things like, try to override local governments, right? He is using the COVID pandemic to increase his power despite having no real interest in speaking to this. I just wanted to also highlight, because it's worth noting the his opponent in the upcoming election, what Beto has been up to. Now, Beto has is just like Abbott, is not somebody who is very allergic to a good photo op. He's showed up at the border. He's talked about this failure of a policy. But let's talk a little bit materially about what Beto thinks should be done. Now, of course, Beto doesn't want to do the stuff that Abbott's doing with DPS inspecting trucks. But on the question of Title 42, which effectively is what this is all about, this is what Beto has said on the matter. Beto O'Rourke knocks Biden for ending Title 42 without a plan to deal with the influx of migrants. Despite the fact that Beto has been, very publicly, when it was, useful for him, a big critic of the racist origins and implications of Title 42. You can see here that his enthusiasm to really changing the status quo is not that not significantly more than, for example, Greg Abbott. Now, Beto, of course, has a lot of if, ands, and buts around this, but it is not a kind of 1-over-1 when compared to what Abbott's policies are here.
I mean, it really reminds me of like Kamala hitting Joe Biden on not supporting busing, and then everyone's like, "Well, what's your different policy?" It's like, actually, no, this is very complicated, and I'm not sure how I differ. I mean, Beto's really frustrating because it's like everything he does seems very unhelpful. Whether it's taking the maximalist position on, yeah, we're coming for your effing guns in Texas. Like, who are you going to get to enforce that, buddy? What law enforcement agency is going to be like, oh, I'm Beto's gun squad, and then taking, like apologizing for like CRT and accepting the framing of like all that stuff is really annoying.
I know it's a difficult state of affairs for sure, but we'll certainly have more as these things develop, and we're going to be talking a lot more about Mexico in just a second. We're going to bring on Kurt Hackbarth. Just really quick pitch before we do that. Please, if you like the work that we've been doing on the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're going to have a lot of fun stuff coming up in the post game this weekend. We have a really fun episode lined up for y'all. With our friend and comrade Lillian Chechirchia, who is talking to us about the history of what we call liberal or civic rights, and the role that socialists have played in building those, and really talking philosophically about how socialists think and argue for and uphold these really, really critical things. So that's going to be coming up for y'all on Sunday. Also, just wanted to note too, we're going to have more announcements logistically about this, but we're going to do a kind of meetup happy hour for people who are Solidarity subscribers and above. I think not next Thursday, but Thursday, April 28th. So if you're in that tier, look out for something. We're trying to find a good time and place to do that.
Yeah, that looks fun.
All right, should we bring on Kurt?
Let's do it.
All right. Hold on one moment. We're joined now by Kurt Hackbarth, who is a journalist out of Mexico, who's written some really, really great pieces for Jacobin. I'm really excited to have him help break down for us some of these recent events in Mexico, and most notably this recall election. Before we get too bogged down in it, how's it going, Kurt?
Good, thanks. Great victory there by Greg Abbott there with a Nuevo Laredo. That was. Can we just say that we don't want Greg Abbott down here at all in any way? So if you could arrange to keep him up there, we'd all be very happy about that.
Well, I think it'd probably be good for all of us.
Yeah. Or somewhere else, but not here.
He truly is a fucking character, man. Lord in heaven. But we wanted to bring you on. I mean, there's a lot to get to, that's been happening in Mexico. But I wanted to start first, just, giving people, kind of brief update, because there was an election over the weekend. Could you sort of break down for people what this recall election was against AMLO and, the story behind it?
Sure. So on this past Sunday, Mexico held its first ever recall election, which is obviously a historic event in the country, which the president, López Obrador, won overwhelmingly with over 90% of the vote. And he won over 15 million votes, which is actually more than he won in his first presidential campaign. So it was actually a good show of strength in that respect. It's important to note, because I think most U.S. media avoids this point, is that AMLO was doing this to fulfill a campaign promise. He called the recall. This wasn't an opposition called recall. This wasn't a California situation with, Gray Davis, Schwarzenegger, and all that. AMLO, in all of his three presidential campaigns, had a plank to submit himself to a recall election halfway through his presidency. Because the Mexican presidency is long. It's 6 years. It's one of the longest terms in the democratic world. And this was a plank of his in all of his three presidential campaigns. And actually, when he was mayor of Mexico City, the second democratically elected mayor of Mexico City, he also did the same thing there. He called a recall halfway through, which he won. So the summary is that AMLO was fulfilling a campaign promise here to call a recall. And we can talk about this in a moment. He won by such an overwhelming number, first because he's a very popular president, but because the opposition chickened out. They didn't want to play ball, right? We can talk about why in a minute, but just to give the quick summary, the recall was a presidential initiative. When AMLO and his party Morena won the election in 2018, they amended the Constitution, together with Congress and the state legislatures, to include referenda and recall in the Constitution. Mexico didn't have that before. So now the Mexican Constitution has binding referenda and recalls in there. There's already been one binding referendum, which the opposition also boycotted. And now they're 2 for 2 boycotting this recall.
I mean, this is the thing that's so interesting about so much of the opposition to AMLO. I mean, you can think about him however you want politically, but this is somebody who is using this position, as you noted, even when he was mayor, to sort of expand some kind of system of what we might call a more direct democracy instead of a kind of mediated thing where, you're just voting for candidates every few years.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's even more significant in the context of Mexican politics, because of the concentration of executive power that has historically existed. The president's rule for 6 years, during the time of the PRI, they were practically, fixed-term dictators. When the PRI governed Mexico uninterruptedly for over 70 years. According to the Mexican Constitution before the recall, the president can only be removed from office for basically treason against the country, which is very hard to prove. They could basically, in a certain sense, do almost what they wanted. And the governors of each state were like, little mini dictators within their own fiefs. This changed finally with, alternation of power, and especially with, the victory of Morena in 2018. But without some form of direct democracy, it would still be, as you say, a very mediated system, right? So a recall at a national level finally gives the opportunity for people, imagine if you had another terrible president like Felipe Calderon, which made a bad, which, first of all, stole the election in a fraudulent election in 2006, and then turned the country into a bloodbath. Imagine a mechanism then to recall Felipe Calderon, how many lives would have been saved? Or Enrique Peña Nieto, this frivolous kind of, boy power kind of president who, sold out Mexico's oil industry by trying to privatize Pemex. Imagine, which was incredibly unpopular. Imagine if there'd been a recall mechanism then to stop some of these disastrous presidencies before, they ground on for 6 years without anything being able to. So that's the important thing here, establishing a precedent. Not that AMLO is ever going to be removed from office. He's very popular, but for the future.
Can you talk about that a little bit more about the opposition to AMLO and the position they're in, where they're simultaneously calling him a tyrant of some sort, and there's a lot of Trump comparisons. I feel like we talked about this last time we talked with you, but like I'm trying to imagine Trump saying, "Yeah, we need a recall system to make sure there's accountability." That's not very Trump-like, right? Like, so just flesh that out for us a little bit.
Right. Kind of the only Western optic to view Latin American leaders, and especially Latin American leaders anywhere, on the center left, is that they're authoritarian populists. There's absolutely no other optic with which the standard Western media can view a Latin American president. So anything will be seen through that optic. Right? Knowing this, Mexico's opposition, which is a coalition now of right-wing parties, the PRI, the right-wing PAN, and a few other smaller parties, kind of did their math when the recall was coming up and realized that they were going to lose. They, realized they had no chance of winning this. At first, the opposition was planning on participating in the recall. Then they realized they were going to lose. They changed their minds, right? Knowing that, or, they could get the gullible U.S. media to go along with this idea that it was a demagogic exercise in aggrandizing presidential power, which is exactly what the New York Times said. I printed, underlined every dumb thing they said in this article. So if we've got 4 hours later, we can go through that. So it was just a chicken shit idea that instead of losing the recall, they were going to try to tar the recall as an exercise in demagogy. Right? And that's what they set out to do. They set out to say, the recall is just López Obrador trying to increase his power, trying to increase his legitimacy, and whatever else. AMLO has no need to increase his legitimacy. He's already legitimate. The presidency by 30 points, and he's very popular. He doesn't need this. No?
Yeah, but also I would say increasing popular accountability, that's a good form of increasing legitimacy.
That's actually good, right? Allowing people to vote on whether a president should remain, right? So the opposition set out to try to undermine the whole exercise by saying it was unnecessary, it was expensive, it was this, it was that, which its high point was this kind of Monty Python-esque farce on the Sunday before the recall, in which the opposition set out to launch a march, the right-wing opposition, in Mexico City with the slogan "Termina si te vas," which is "finish your term and then leave." Okay. Considering the president in Mexico can't be reelected, that's exactly what AMLO was going to do. Going to finish his term and leave. So they marched, telling him very strongly to finish his term and leave. Pretty impressive. And as you said, Matt, important figures in the opposition over the last 3 years have been saying to anyone who will listen that AMLO is the next Hitler. Mm-hmm. He's a Mussolini figure. He's a Duce, and he's in the practice of perpetuating coup d'états. He's a dictator. He's a menace. So with all of this, hyperbolic rhetoric of AMLO as Hitler, Mussolini, a fascist and a communist, kind of a mashup, anything that's bad, anything that sounds bad, right? Then they get the opportunity to throw the man out in a recall ahead of his term, because he's obviously a terrible monster. I mean, who would want someone like that to remain in office even 5 more minutes? But no, we're not going to do the recall.
I mean, that's the cowardly thing about most of the opposition stuff that I was seeing from folks. It's like, if he is so illegitimate and unpopular, then he opened himself up to you. Take your chance right now. You've broken down a good bit of this, but I also just wanted to ask you, one, I remember reading in your piece that he had initially tried to, hold this in the midterms, right, when there would necessarily be more turnout, and the opposition opposed that. Could you also break down the INE, the Electoral Commission, and sort of what they did in this most recent election? Because I've also heard that there was a lot of complaints about, there being sort of lack of funding, and it was sort of difficult for some people to be able to show up to polls.
Well, the Electoral Institute down here, the National Electoral Institute of the INE, is a bastion of conservatism, and the leaders, Lorenzo Córdoba and Ciro Moriyama, have been doing everything possible to gum up the works, not only in this, but the previous referendum that was held on exploring, and investigating the crimes of former presidents. The INE claims that there wasn't enough of a budget to carry out the recall. The INE is one of the most expensive electoral institutes in the world. It receives one of the biggest budgets of any electoral institute in any country. Now, conservatives will say it's because the INE performs more functions. Well, their main function is to carry out elections. I mean, which they don't do very well, because in this case, they only opened up 1/3 of the precincts. Mm-hmm. And then AMLO got 15 million votes. Imagine that, only 1/3 of the precincts were open. I mean, that's like voter suppression that even beats Texas.
Yeah.
Which is something. And not only that, but a lot of the precincts were changed. You had changed places. So,
oh Lord.
the precinct where the people vote here in the neighborhood is usually at a school a couple blocks away. This time it wasn't at the school, it was at a place in another neighborhood. How did you have to find that out? You had to go online and go into an app and figure it out, or go into the website. Well, a lot of people here are poor, and they don't have smartphones, and they don't have internet access as easily. So it's not that easy for them to, go on there and find out where the precinct was. Now, if they claim they didn't have a lot of money, at least what they could have done is go to the old precinct and put up a sign. That would have been nice, right? The voting isn't here, it's somewhere else, and there's the address. But they didn't do that because they're not interested in turnout. The whole idea is to undermine the whole process, right, from the get-go. These commissioners at the INE have fantastic salaries. They receive a higher salary than the president. They've actually gone to court to try to keep their large salaries because the Constitution says that no one in the federal government should make more than the president. So they've got their interests in mind. The promotion of the event was very scant. There was very little promotion. They did the bare minimum, right? And then would penalize people or punish political parties like Morena for trying to promote the referendum, which is fine because electoral law prohibits political parties from promoting the referendum because the idea is to it be a partisan exercise. But they don't know anybody else to promote it, but then they're not going to promote it themselves, right? And then the people who were promoting the idea of the boycott, they weren't punished at all because technically they weren't promoting recall, they were promoting not recall. So it becomes silly. It becomes silly because not because they were, applying electoral law, which they have to do. It's because they were doing it in bad faith. And it was obvious that they were doing it in bad faith because they didn't want this thing to succeed, right? Because they didn't want, what they knew was going to be AMLO's victory and a shot in the arm for the movement, because it was a shot in the arm for the movement. They turned out 15 million people on Palm Sunday for a recall that was not lined up with any other election. There was no other election that day. It's hard to get people out for a recall if there's no other election that day, unless it's been heavily, heavily, heavily promoted. This is the beginning of Holy Week down here. A lot of people are traveling. They go back to their pueblos. They're going home. They finally, people down here don't get a lot of vacation. So they're going back to their pueblos and going back to see their families. Getting 15 million people, actually the 16.5 million people voted in total, 15 million in favor of AMLO. That's a pretty impressive number. That's a pretty impressive show of organizing muscle. And it got people motivated. I think one of the big things on the left that's always an important thing that's always been debated, right, is people get motivated for an election, and then they get demotivated. And then they get motivated for another election, and then they get demotivated. And it goes like this in cycles, and it doesn't work that way. You have to be motivated constantly. You do that. That's been a big debate. Well, this recall did get people motivated, and it got people out. Just before a big showdown this week in Congress about AMLO's energy reform constitution. Mm-hmm. So it was timely in that respect.
Yeah, again, as somebody who I'm a big believer in democracy and like trying to get the people as close to power as possible. So I have a hard time sort of reckoning with anybody who treats these things as a bad thing. We're going to get to this energy reform stuff in a moment because I think it's really, really important actually. But before we do, if you wouldn't mind indulging us a little bit, Kurt, we do have to take a visit to our friends up in New York because the way that AMLO is presented...
I've got it right here.
I'm so ready that you did your homework. Because the way that AMLO is presented in the U.S., again, as we were saying earlier, is like, this kind of authoritarian anti-democracy. And I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt because even when I'm looking on the New York Times for its coverage on Mexico, it's actually surprisingly sparse in English. I don't know. You'd think our neighbor, there's a lot of things that are going on. There'd be a lot more coverage of what's going on internally and in Mexico. And, there's a few and far between. But this is a piece here that was published. Oh, sorry, Matt. It's the
different one.
The biggest. I have it right here. No worries.
Yeah. The biggest promoter of Mexico's presidential recall election, the president.
It's coming right here. Yeah, which is just an amazing title.
If anybody wants to play along at home, bring this up on your screen and we can go through this.
I'd be happy to.
We should just do a special segment on,
let's do it.
New York Times dumb reporting on Latin America. a regular segment.
We wouldn't run out. Yeah, take us through. I mean, I have a couple lined up, but if you want to go through this and note some of them, I'd be happy to.
Well, let's just go through some of them. So, we're going about 4 paragraphs down. Mr. Lopez Obrador has called the recall an exercise in democracy. And that's in quotes, right? Because recall isn't by nature an exercise in democracy, so that has to be put in quotes, right? Critics say it actually amounts to something far more cynical. An effort to bolster the president's claim to power. Actually, the president doesn't need a claim to power because he's very popular and he won by 30 million votes. And a tool to undermine his detractors. Yes, the whole thing was a cunning plan to make his detractors look stupid. Actually, they did that on their own by sitting it out. Right? How did he know ahead of time that they were going to boycott the recall?
Yeah. Especially given the fact that what we were told here on, English Twitter, at least, is that AMLO is extremely unpopular and everybody is just waiting for their moment to finally throw the tyrant and the dictator out of office.
Yes, of course, as we saw. And actually in that other article that you put up before this one, the Mexican voters back Lopez Obrador, they said, this Natalie Kitteroff, AMLO's approval rating has slipped dangerously from 66 to 59%. That's actually...
As an American, it's just like, what are you talking about?
It's like Biden would drool, and that's not ageism. Biden would love to have even 59%, right? And polls, he's up in the high 60s or whatever else, right? But just this menacing, his popularity has slipped to, just so pathetic.
A majority of the population.
Right. and it chose the lowest of the polls to get there.
Of course.
So, and then it says down here, Mr. Lopez Obrador proposed the recall. Actually, he proposed it in all of his presidential campaigns. So it's a campaign promise that he had to fulfill. Because let's just imagine if AMLO had been unpopular now. Right, as the conservatives thought he would be by now. Imagine if his popularity was down in Biden levels, right? The opposition would be demanding that he hold the recall. They would be demanding that he hold the recall. And why isn't he holding the recall?
He promised.
It during the campaign, and he's not doing it. That's exactly what would be happening right now, and so would the New York Times, if his popularity was down where they thought it would be by now. But because AMLO's popularity didn't follow their narrative, they had to change it, right? They had to flip it on its head, right? And try to turn it into something else. Analysts say he will use it to manufacture a political victory, even if participation is low. Well, actually, he doesn't need to manufacture anything. Doesn't need to, right? This is supposed to be a mechanism for civic control of power, but it's become instead an instrument of political propaganda, says Carlos Bravo Regidor, political analyst. So a recall is propaganda now. A recall is propaganda, right? Opening yourself up to getting thrown out of office is propaganda. Next paragraph. On a balmy Monday in Mexico City, volunteers in the president's camp fanned out across a residential neighborhood armed with flyers and wide grins. Flyers and wide grins. Can we belittle people anymore?
It's the purge.
Nearby polling stations and telling anyone who would listen to go vote in the recall. Actually, that's what canvassing is.
Yes, I know. I mean,
canvassing is telling people who will listen. Actually, you see, like this to belittle people. I'm sorry.
No. This is great. I mean, I just really want to highlight again, like this is why we, selected this piece because, I had just read it. I read the New York Times, to sort of see what everyone else is reading. And I read this piece, and even for the way that AMLO is usually covered, I was just amazed because everything is made out to be sinister. I mean, like
everything.
You use the word recall, and like obviously that's the correct terminology because that's the kind of vote it is. But you use a new term like that, and it makes it seem like something. Like imagine that line right here, where he says, AMLO has called the vote an exercise in democracy. Like that just automatically sounds completely absurd, right? It's always using
in quotes. in quotes, right? It's an exercise in democracy, right?
Or people being armed with flyers, right?
Yes.
You know, I mean, there is a tone to it that is it's so apparent. It's truly amazing.
It's so condescending, is what it is. It's absolutely condescending to people who believe in democracy and are out there spending their volunteer time to promote an exercise in direct democracy, which the country has never had.
And this is an opinion piece, or this is not an opinion piece, right? This is just news.
It's not an opinion piece, right? Next paragraph. Alan Polsos, one of the group's leaders, said he hoped the exercise would set a precedent so future leaders could be kicked out if needed. This time, though, he just wants the president to know he's loved. See? How they belittle supporters, because they make them sound like mindless, right? Mindless bots who are out there supporting the president, right? Imagine all these New York Times readers over their cappuccinos, right? And have, they just want the president to know he's loved, right? A few more down. Tell me if we're going over time on this.
No, I mean, this is great. This is perfect for us.
A couple paragraphs down. Such a show of support could not come at a better time for the president, who has passed the midpoint of his term while struggling to deliver on key campaign promises. Actually, the recall is a campaign promise. This was a campaign promise, actually. He won on this platform, actually. That swept into office on a landslide victory, right? And then, of course, they go through, the country is not where it's supposed to be because, there's been a pandemic and all this stuff, as has happened all over the world. And next paragraph, but he has remained popular. This flummoxes the New York Times that he's popular despite their piercing analysis that he shouldn't be. And they're not listening to them in Mexico. With more than half of Mexicans approving of his performance, polls show. His government has sought to improve the lot of the poor, raising the minimum wage 4 times and boosting welfare spending, which is coded, right? Because if it's welfare, imagine what Americans think of welfare.
For sure.
Or whatever else. When actually it's been a very series of universal programs, which is more like, Social Security, Medicare, like that. So actually the comparison should be with the universal programs in the United States, right? But they don't say that. They say welfare because that's a flash word. Mr. López Obrador has also won points with symbolic gestures. This is how the New York Times explains why he's popular, with symbolic gestures, right? And then the next paragraph, they talk about his high favor is also a tribute to his relentless broadcasting of an official narrative. So he's not popular because he's done things for people, like raise the minimum wage, senior pensions, scholarships for student, aid to farmers, unemployment pension, disability pension, aid to single mothers. None of those things. It's just been symbolic gestures and relentless broadcasting on official narrative. Because that would be the only way to justify why he remains popular, right? To a stupid public who can't appreciate the fact that he's actually improved their material lives. Right? People must be too stupid or too caught up in the messianic love of AMLO to be able to appreciate that he has actually improved their material lives.
Let me share this with you. I didn't send this to you beforehand, but this is something that I saw just this afternoon. This is let me just show this to you. I'll put the translate on for our friends here. But this is making a pretty nasty insinuation about AMLO's victory here, which is basically saying that the more illiterate the population becomes, the more likely that they are to vote to AMLO. I mean, vote for AMLO. I mean, this is just. I mean, this is like anti-poor, anti-working people, certainly anti-indigenous, as far as it goes. And I just don't think, because it doesn't penetrate into the kind of American media sphere as much, how severe this hatred of the people really is from a political class in Mexico, and certainly from Americans who are following this too.
The elitism and the classism, and it's a racism because the south of Mexico is much more indigenous, right? Than the north and center. So it's a very toxic brew there. And it's actually not very far away from what the New York Times is saying, right? People are dumb. And so they are taken in by symbolic gestures and relentless broadcasting of an official narrative, right? Rather than, making a very rational decision, Here's just an example. I was just talking, we're out in a pueblo outside of Oaxaca the other day with a family who rode out the pandemic because the grandparents in the family now have a pension. The children in the family now have scholarships, stay in school scholarships. If they stay in school and maintain grades, they get a scholarship. And because they're family of farmers, they were also getting farm aid.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's a pretty rational choice. It's a pretty rational decision. And they said, this family said, and it's very interesting, if this country has enough money to do all this, why didn't they do it before? Where was all the money going before? That's a very rational question, because it was getting stolen. They said, because the line is always, we're too poor for these things. Well, but it turns out there was budget for all these things. Where was it going before? Well, it was getting stolen.
But Kurt, I mean, he's doing it all wrong. He's doing it all wrong. He's not living in the presidential mansion. He's not riding in the private jet. I mean, there truly is. I mean, again, I mean, and this is not even unique to the way Mexico is covered. It's like whenever working people are supporting a kind of rational decision to say that, like, you know, we want more social spending, we want good programs here, they're treated as idiots, right? Like, this is a very specific example, but it was one thing that really pissed me off here in the States, because, you know, there's a big thing about, is Texas going to turn Democrat because of demographics, right? And, you know, you're finding that a lot of people in South Texas, still vast majority of them vote Democrat, but there's like been some inroads for the Republican Party. And when Trump got elected, when he lost, but when in 2020, when during that election, Trump made some gains in South Texas. And when people did interviews with folks, people said things like, you know, they sent me money and that really helped my family out. Right. And we can do all the real, it's like, oh, that wasn't really Trump, that was Congress or whatever. But there was this kind of snideness about, it's like, oh, these people are stupid. And it's like, well, no, the government could and should have been doing a hell of a lot for people for a very long time. And this is just an example of people being extremely rational and saying, if the government's going to look out for me and my family, I'm going to support it. Right. And like, if Trump is taking false credit for it, like, that's on y'all to be out there first and foremost, like owning those kind of policies and saying you want to win on those, which Biden wasn't doing.
And actually, in a lot of those communities in South Texas were Mexican-American communities. And you heard some of the same thing. You know, oh, these Mexican-Americans, you know, they just love these messianic power figures like Trump, which, you know, hence the Trump-AMLO comparisons. They're easily taken in. They're easily taken in by, you know, strongmen because they're Latinos. You know, they never said it. They never ever said it that explicitly, but that was up.
For sure. That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, are there any more highlights in this piece before we move on? I don't want to rush you. I know.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point. I think most people get it. Just one more towards the end.
Yes.
There are, of course, strategic benefits that could come from asking the country to weigh in on what like the president at this particular moment, because it's all just a strategic benefit. Mr. López Obrador founded his political party and has an obvious interest in doing everything possible to ensure its victory, right? This is, again, a continuation of the narrative that he only did it to benefit himself as a political strategy and for Morena to win next time around.
I mean, obviously this is coming from the States here, but do you think that there's an effort, because, you know, you're making the point that I think is really important here, that, you know, this is adding a precedent that could be very beneficial in the future. Or do you think that there is so much kind of, you know, freak out about this and trying to treat it as illegitimate to basically trying to block, you know, a future attempt to call for a recall, you know, if a right-wing president comes into power in the near future?
I think that's absolutely the case. Yeah. And I think that's why the opposition is scared of this. It's scared of this because they do not want to establish the precedent of someone else, you know, a very toxic right-wing president being subject to a recall. I think that's very clear.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to this last bit because, you know, we were just talking there about some of the material reasons that they're getting worked about this stuff, because as you were noting earlier, there's some really big congressional fights coming up. And, you know, most notably, and the first time we had you on the program was actually to talk about this proposal here. But, you know, AMLO is trying to do something that I would say is very in line with people who listen to the show at Left Reckoning, something that we talk about a lot, which is like we really need to increase public control over our energy sector. If you're serious about climate change, hell, if you're just serious about how reliant your power system is. Having more public buy-in and more public control of these things is really, really crucial. Could you help people understand? We don't have to go granular here, but like if you could help people understand what this constitutional energy reform is.
Sure. What AMLO wants to do is to strengthen the hand of the public sector in Mexican energy, which, because of the reforms of Peña Nieto in 2013, 2014, has been largely privatized. And what they've done is they've created a system where the Public Federal Energy Commission has to buy energy from private companies, right? So it guaranteed profits for them. And then these companies, there's a provision in the law that allows for self-supply. You can self-supply yourself through renewable resources and such. So this is only supposed to be for self-supply. But what happens is giant companies like Spain's Iberdrola or Italy's Enel, whatever else, have abused this privilege to set up a parallel energy network in Mexico, where they create energy and then they sell it through the public grid to private companies like Walmart or Mitsubishi or the OXXO convenience stores, who wind up paying much less per capita in their energy bills than average people, right? It's a gamed system. It's a gamed system where private companies are guaranteed profits and can also set up a parallel energy network, a parallel business using the public infrastructure, right? So what AMLO is saying is we're going to strengthen the Federal Energy Commission so that the Federal Energy Commission has more powers to handle these things, and they buy public sources of energy first. That's first. They buy public energy first. And then whatever other need is there will be bought from private companies, right? So it's not a full nationalization. What he's saying is you buy public sources of energy first, because it was the way it was set up now was a way to bleed the Federal Energy Commission out. They were supposed to be competing against the same people that they were being forced to subsidize, right? So it was setting up a situation where over time, the Federal Energy Commission was going to be bankrupt, right? Because it wouldn't work. So it's like a slow-mo privatization. So what you get now is a huge campaign against that from Iberdrola, from Enel, and from American interests. You know, the U.S. ambassador Ken Salazar has been practically knocking on AMLO's door every day over the last few weeks. You know, we don't like this. This is not good. Whatever else. And what the most insidious thing about it is they've been greenwashing the hell out of this thing. And basically, they've tried to set up this argument, which is false, that private energy production in Mexico is renewable, and that public energy production in Mexico is dirty and fossil fuel. So these wonderful, magnanimous private companies are actually on the vanguard of the renewable energy revolution in Mexico. And that's false. It's just a falsehood. Private companies do produce some renewable energy, but it's about a tenth. For example, Iberdrola, it's a tenth of the energy that they produce in the country. 90% of it is natural gas or other fossil fuels. And from the public side, there is, a mix of energy. There's hydroelectric, and they're putting in a big solar farm in Sonora and such, right? But the whole debate down here has been to use a greenwashing argument to make it look like private companies are the saviors of renewable energy down here against a public government which wants to turn the clock back to the 70s and go back to a fossil fuel paradise. Like AMLO swims in oil every day because he grew up in Tabasco, right, where there's a lot of oil. And it's very disingenuous. And it's very, very, very disingenuous.
I mean, this is like a very important bit, and I highly suggest people, it's not about what's going on in Mexico per se, but like it's a similar kind of fight. There's a piece in Jackman recently put out by Fred Stafford and Matt Huber, really breaking down some of these dynamics between public and private power and green energy, because I'm telling you all this, and I've been, I've been very worried about. That's why I've been covering so much on this program about what the future of this kind of greenwashing is going to look like for projects of bringing public, power under public control, is to sort of, make it seem like these private corporations are the ones who are actually green, and it's the big dirty public grids and systems that are so nasty, and we need to get rid of them. I mean, in the U.S., there's horrible carve-outs to basically make it extremely difficult for public power, companies to, that are really owned by the state, to be pursuing green energy. But we'd be remiss not to note the kind of neo-colonial aspect of this too. I mean, you noted Ken Salazar, but also the Spanish government has not been in favor of this. I mean, there's been a pretty big pushback against AMLO and Mexico doing whatever they want to with their own country with the power supply there.
Yeah, Ken Salazar actually came out and said a week ago, I don't know where we're headed with the electricity reform. It's like, who's we? There's no we here, Yeah, I'm not dancing with you, Ken. Who's we? But this is the attitude. The Spanish government has said that they will react very strongly against the electricity reform. Salazar and John Kerry, the climate envoy, have been down here twisting AMLO's arm and saying we need to have an American task force to oversee the electricity reform, right? What? An American task force? All right, let's have a Mexican task force. America's immigration reform debate. Let's set them up and have them write in Congress and see how that goes over, right? But it's just implicitly understood that, the U.S., Spain, can say these things, with no pushback by the media, because it's implicitly the implicit idea is, yes, of course, an American task force should be overseeing how the Mexicans handle, their own electricity, right? Just this week, an Italian lobbyist was busted in the Mexican Congress, sitting in the seats where the representatives sit with the opposition. And so somebody had to call a point of order in the Congress and said, excuse me, there's an Italian lobbyist sitting in, can he get out of here, please?
Yeah.
Because Italy also has interests here through Enel, the big company Enel. So it's become a huge debate here over the last week. Who the hell are all these lobbyists and where do they come from, right? This has been a kind of a delayed debate down here. The U.S. is quite, we're all very familiar with who lobbyists are and what they do, right? But the job of lobbyists back in the PRI days was kind of behind the scenes, right? But the left is in power, all of a sudden they're coming out of the woodwork, right? And making themselves much more visible.
I mean, it's truly impressive. Kurt has a piece in Jacobin, which people should check out, that breaks down a lot of these relationships called American think tanks are fueling the Mexican. But there's a particular one that I'd be curious if you could sort of talk us through. It's called the Baker Institute. And its role here.
Well, the Baker Institute, right in your guys' neighborhood there in Houston, more or less, set up, in honor of James Baker, right, the Secretary of State under Daddy Bush, and who helped Bush steal Florida, right, as his campaign manager. And the Baker Institute was set up in 1993 as supposedly a nonpartisan institute to do research, academic research that's going to be the benefit of the world, right? Interestingly enough, the institute has both an Institute for Energy Studies, right, and a Center for U.S.-Mexico Relations, right? Very interesting that they have both of those, because that for them very much overlaps, because for the United States, Mexico is all about getting the energy, right? Opening Mexico to energy, right? So what's interesting about the Baker Institute is the role that it and other think tanks play in U.S.-Mexico relations. One of the big funders of the Institute is a big Mexican magnate called Claudio X Gonzalez, right? Who's in the statesman circle of big donors. One of the big fellows is Jesus Reyes Roles, who was the head of Pemex before. And to go through what the Baker Institute does for the Mexico-U.S. Center, it's basically a machine of right-wing propaganda. You just go through event after event after event on their website. AMLO is turning back the clock. AMLO's energy reforms are terrible. Mexico needs to be competitive and give consumers choice in energy. Just like all the talking points. Just all the talking points are there. And they've got an $11 million budget a year to, to do a lot with these talking points. So what I think we have to analyze from the left is how these think tanks create a tax-deductible space where, in this case, Mexican oligarchs and, American academics, lobbyists, business people, graduate students, journalists who, agree with them can come together and have all these events and have all these forums and all these connections and all these contacts, take Mexican talking points, translate them into English, and then disseminate them through experts into the US media, and do the same. Take all the crap from the talking points and insert them down into the Mexican media, which is how you get this really strange alignment of talking points a lot of times between the Mexican media and the US. With talking points, with think tanks like Baker, like the Wilson Institute in Washington, and others, to act as intermediaries in all this. That's something that needs to be analyzed, and I think needs a lot more attention paid to.
No, I can't tell you how much I agree with you on that. Like, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a journalist, but after college, I spent a couple of years sort of, trying to break into that world in DC, and I worked for a couple different English, news sites. I worked for Al-Arabiya and things like that. And it was amazing to see, because you had, journalists who, a lot of them were overworked, and they were having to write about a lot of different subjects. And it's like, there's certainly like a cynical side to it. And then there's like an overworked side to it where it's like, wow, some guy just sent me basically a whole brief that I can produce as an article without having to do any kind of real work or even call many sources because they're already all right here, all the quotes. It really plays a big role, and a lot of progressives in this country, understandably, because it's important, but they really focus on, money and politics in the sense of like who's getting campaign contributions. But the entire nexus of think tanks it plays a much larger role than I think a lot of people who are sort of outside of that sphere recognize.
Yeah, and you see that certainly in issues like Mexico, because as you say, reporters are overworked, they're corporations, right? They're being forced to churn out articles. Budget cutbacks in the newsrooms, they don't want to send a correspondent down to Mexico. A lot of times they don't care that much about Mexico. So it's very easy to just plug in to this information that's right there from the think tanks. And the think tanks know that. Tanks know that. They're basically filling in the void that's being, left by the lack of news and investigative journalism in the U.S. And it has very insidious results in this kind of case because you wind up getting an absolutely skewed narrative that has nothing to do with what's actually going on the ground down here.
Well, I know, we don't have to sit here and make too many predictions, but going into this fight, how is it looking? The possibility of AMLO winning out on this?
Well, here's the story. The situation is fluid. AMLO needs to get a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress because it's a constitutional level reform, which is difficult because he's going to have to get opposition votes. Morena has a majority, but it doesn't, and its allies, but it doesn't have a 2/3 majority. And there's actually been kind of a sense over the last few days that the opposition is so upset that the recall went well, and they got a bloody nose from it, that they're now determined to make sure that Morena loses in something. Whatever it is, they want to make sure Morena loses in something. So it's very possible that the electricity reform, the votes on Sunday, may not pass. But AMLO, ever the strategist, right, the chess player, said, if it doesn't pass, then very next day, I'm sending an amendment to the mining law to make sure that lithium is nationalized. Now, it won't be constitutional level, but it'll still be a law, right? So he's kind of looking past that. He also got a good ruling from the Supreme Court a week or so ago, which says his original energy law is constitutional because many people thought they were going to rule it unconstitutional. So he proposed the constitutional reform because it locks it in more, but also with the concern that maybe the Supreme Court would take his law and call it unconstitutional. That law was ruled constitutional. So between that and the reform to the mining law, it would do most of what he wanted to do with the constitutional reforms. Anyway, now, they're going all out to make sure it passes on Sunday. But if it doesn't, you always have to have a plan B. And the plan B, we're taking the mining law and we're going to put in make sure that the lithium is the property of the nation in that.
That's huge. Well, Kurt, I really appreciate you spending some time with us this evening. We'll definitely have to have you back on to do some more New York Times debunking. That was a hell of a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
it's always fun because it's like shooting fish in a barrel, isn't it?
Well, everyone can find Kurt's work in Jackman Magazine. We'll also have links for other ways that you can follow. And please take care, friend.
Okay. Take care, guys. Thanks.
See you around.
Take care.
Bye.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Kurt's got a good section in the Jacobin piece. In Mexico, AMLO's opponents are resorting to smear campaigns on the media cast.
Oh yeah,
and the revelation of somebody's salary and how that's putting everybody on edge. That is worth checking out. Very eye opening how their media works down there.
Oh, for sure. And the House I think was in Houston. That everyone was getting worked up about. I will just say we're going to go to this last segment before we go to the post game. But I just want to note, and maybe I'm just really obsessed over this, but I do think that this fight over energy is so important. It's important here in Texas. It's important in whatever community that you're living in, and it's certainly important in Mexico. And I talked yesterday. I let you know this, Matt, but I revisited one of our old segments at the beginning of the pandemic with Michael, and we were sort of talking about like what might happen out of this COVID thing. And, there was a lot of hope that maybe people would see some of the, curvature of neoliberalism and, something would happen. And, that's certainly not the case. There is not going to be any kind of non-political event that sort of shifts and shakes up this system. So living in that kind of paradigm that, certainly like re-cemented itself through Biden and a lot of the kind of more centrist resurgence that we've seen since the beginning of this pandemic. We need to start looking at what are the big fights going to be over this next decade. And there is no doubt about it that it's not just climate change, like in the abstract. It's going to be about who controls energy. And you're seeing this, and this is where it gets really nasty with, liberals like Kerry and Salazar and the Biden administration basically trying to push back against an initiative in Mexico. Despite people thinking of, John Kerry, for example, as this great, green warrior. This is what this next chapter of this fight is going to be. And I don't have, the answer other than winning, and building political power. But this is something that needs to be on your radar. It's in sort of, recognizing the fact that they are already trying to set the stage for like this next generation of energy production. They're trying to do it in a way that maintains corporate power above all else. And, it's time to get really smart about this shit. Because, they're working overtime, and I worry sometimes that we aren't as much as we should be. Yeah. Well, talking about things that we're right about, I think we want to take a little bit of a victory lap, right, Matt?
Yeah. So was it last December?
I think it was the end of 2021. It was our big one for the year.
Yeah,
we haven't done this segment in a while. Abbott was an honorary bump steer, but he's sort of like always in there for us.
Yeah, I know. I feel like we just started doing Elon Musk every time. But yeah, so for the bump steer of the year, it was Pramila Jayapal, leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, for her decision to, I forget exactly the congressional maneuvering now that basically sunk the Build Back Better bill, but basically folded and said we can trust.
She supported two-track.
Right, to two-track, right, exactly. So that's why we got the bipartisan infrastructure bill that no one gives an absolute fuck about. And we did not get Build Back Better. And that was thanks to her strategy.
And we got a lot of flack for that. I mean, I'll just say it again. I'm a democratic socialist. Like when I think about my politics, I'm not really thinking about the larger progressives. I see there's plenty of opportunities to do work with them, but I don't know. I don't see them as necessarily like sitting on the bench with me on my team, right? We can be friendly, but there's a distance from that. But we got a lot of people who were getting mad at us for saying, "Oh, why would you come at Jayapal? She's doing so much. She's so clearly on her side, and we shouldn't be like, cementing any kind of discord." But there was a pretty big announcement today then I think should make people think twice and prove that, again, Matt and I were right about how deep those commitments are to a kind of general, like, again, not even socialist or democratic socialist politics, but just a kind of continuation of the massively popular and massively successful, even though it didn't end up winning the White House, but it's still a very important part of the political mosaic right now, which is the Bernie Sanders political movement.
Yeah. And so I don't know, like this is very similar to Nancy Pelosi endorsing Cuellar, right? And I think like the overall lesson is, like.
Oh, well, can we tell? Well, people might not know the news yet.
The news?
There's about about the Progressive Caucus. Why we're mad about them? They endorsed against Nina Turner in the Democratic primary, and instead, are promoting just like the most typical kind of soft on the vast majority of progressive issues, centrist kind of Democrat against somebody like Nina Turner, who is very clearly 2 foot on the side of the Bernie Sanders movement.
Yeah, Chantel Brown was pitched herself as, unlike Nina Turner, who called Joe Biden the shit sandwich or whatever she called him, Brown's going to have Biden's back. And what is she doing? What is she doing in the short time in Congress? She's undermining Joe Biden's efforts to reinstitute the Iran deal, renegotiate it. And that would not be a surprise to anybody who knew where her funding for campaign was coming from, in large part to Democratic Majority for Israel. Remember that name because they're going to be a big problem in progressive elections going forward. It's really gross. And like, I mean, I think the thing with making Jayapal that bumps here is, what is the CPC worth? Like, what do you get? What's the point of this at this point? Oh, you're muted, David.
I'm trying to find a tweet from David Sirota, but it's not coming up, but I'll paraphrase him. I hope I'm getting this accurately.
Oh, he might have deleted that one. It was spicy. It was
okay.
It was
then maybe that's why I couldn't find it.
It's like, this might be Pramila Jayapal selling out to
get a committee appointment that they won't be able, that she won't enjoy long because they're about to get smoked in the upcoming midterm elections. I mean, look, I think that you could make one criticism here of how the segment has gone, and that's like, you got to share the blame a little bit. I think that's 100% accurate. That this is a big loss for the Congressional Progressive Caucus in general, and again, we've never been people who have sat around and argued, like, the people who are on the periphery for us is like AOC and like Bowman, and Ilhan, right? The other people who are in the CPC, I don't consider them necessarily to be parts of this movement. And this is like a very, very apparent stabbing in the back of that movement, and it's showing that post Bernie Sanders without the viability of those presidential campaigns, right? And with the viability comes risk if you're somebody in the Democratic Party who's supporting Bernie. But it also gives you a bit of a shield because, you can point to how popular it was, right? Without having that kind of event of a, Democratic national primary like that, you're seeing what characters, what people in that organization, how far they're willing to go and how quickly they are to retreat, into the arms of the established Democratic Party.
Yeah. So I don't know. It is sort of like, I guess, a victory lap for our predictive powers,
but it's a very bad one.
And it is, exactly.
No, he didn't delete his tweet just so we can have the record. Good. Let me put it up since I brought it up.
Right.
Just give me one moment. Let's be clear. This is very likely Jayapal selling out the entire movement because of her unbridled ambitions to get a fancy but meaningless leadership title among a House Dem caucus that will be obliterated in midterms. A total betrayal on every level. And I think that's a fair way to put that. I mean, this is a good reason to find ways to, continue to support, Nina Turner. Nina Turner is, somebody who I certainly support as a congressional candidate. She's somebody, though, who is sort of like on that 1 foot in, 1 foot out, in the sense that she's not necessarily a socialist. And we talk about the problems with our elected officials, who are associated with the movement. so keep that in your head. I don't mean to, to not say don't support or anything like that, but just, in the terms of, I don't know, accuracy in like my kind of congressional opinion on how we should think about congressional politics as socialists, understand that going into it. But no doubt about it, for the Bernie Sanders movement that we all supported and so many people became politicized from, this is somebody who is your tribune. This is somebody who has, at a lot of personal risk, gone out there and fought for these things. And this is somebody who you would certainly want to have in Congress, if anything else, for the fact that she's not a coward like a lot of these other people who've shown themselves to be kind of political social climbers. And they like to support things that are popular. And remember, the party is against Medicare for all, despite the fact that it is immensely popular. And I support and think it's a prerequisite for any kind of association or endorsement. Let it be a DSA one, or even just like for people who are the left, that you support Medicare for all. But also remember that, those things are like so morally easy and so clearly popular that, just because there's so much pushback in the Democratic Party against it, to think that people who say they support it, have big backbones and are willing to, to stand up when the rubber hits the road. Right. And we're seeing the serious lack there. The answer here, just so people don't think that this segment is about getting doomer and black pilled and sitting out of politics. The solution here is we need to be cultivating our own talent. We need to be involving yourselves in movements. This is like, if you're somebody who watches a lot of politics, right, and campaign for Bernie Sanders, but you're not a part of an organization, this is a real moment when you should find a way to get involved. You don't have to donate 100% of your time or anything like that, but this shows that we're not just going to get it through an invigorated progressive media sphere. Right. We're not just going to get it, because everybody's going to wake up one day. We're only going to get it through real organizing and making those people accountable to us, because the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is not accountable to you. Right. Yeah. That's why they're going to do this shit. And we can be mad at them. Rightfully so. We can criticize them. Rightfully so. But the solution has to be a commitment to engagement, in real engagement with your community and through an organization, because that's the only way you're going to get out of this constant cycle of excitement and disappointment.
I agree. And hopefully we'll have a good exponent of this independent socialist electoral strategy in the future. But that's all I want to tease at this point.
Oh, hell yeah. Well, y'all, this was a lot of fun. I mean, I'd like to have Kurt on every week. He was great. And we got a lot of fun stuff coming up in the post game, though. We're going to hang out as we usually do. We're going to take a look at some very, very frightening images from Elon Musk's Gigafactory rodeo. We got a Saki clip. I think we got a couple other things. And as always, we got your voicemails, which we can throw up that number here. Remember, if you're not a Patreon, you won't be able to hear your answers or anything like that, but you can leave us a voicemail, and we play those during the post game. We also answer people's questions from the Discord. So come on, come and join us in the post game and hang out with us for a little bit. And this Sunday, you're not going to want to miss it. Bar none, probably one of our most popular guests. And now I would say LR crew, Lillian Chichurchia, was on the program, and we're going to release a conversation that we had with her about socialists and liberal rights. It was a really insightful and exciting conversation. And, whenever I see Lillian, it's like, click, you're going to want to see that. So sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to that this Sunday. And we'll see y'all in just a little bit for the post game.
Peace.